Radon gas is a soil gas, and most people usually hear about it for the first time when they're in the middle of a real estate transaction. And so the realtor will have that item on a list of inspections as choices, of what they can inspect. So that's usually when a radon test is conducted. The radon comes from the ground. It's naturally occurring. We breathe it outside, we breathe it inside, but inside it can be trapped in higher levels that are dangerous to us. And radon does cause lung cancer. In fact, it's the second leading cause of lung cancer around the world. And every year there's about 21,000 or more radon cancer-induced deaths. And a lot of them are even from never smokers. So if you've ever heard of someone who's died of lung cancer and they never smoked, radon could definitely be one of those causes. And so in the real estate transaction is where we see it tested. Often a buyer will come in and do that test. And sometimes the seller doesn't even know what it is, or they've never tested their home. And so that's when we see tests come out high. And where we live here in Indiana, we are in a high radon zone. And there's nothing that we can really do to prevent that. It's just the way that the rock is underneath the ground, way back from the Ice Age when glaciers came through here and deposited things. And so we do see more radon here in our area and in Indiana than a lot of parts of the country. And so the national average on radon is 7% of homes are being, having high radon levels over the EPA's action limit. And around here, we see way more than that, almost 30% in Indiana. So it's a lot. So you can imagine 1 out of 3 houses having that in our area. So we always tell people to never not buy a house because of radon. We say, if you love the house, buy the house, fix the house. We would rather see a house with a system and know that levels are good all the time than even have a passing test at like 3 point something, because the lower the levels, the better. So when we talk about that action limit and why they have one is the EPA had to decide how much radon would be, too much radon, where they want to see that fixed. So they came up with a number that's measured in a fancy word called picocuries per liter. But we're looking for that number, and that number is 4.0. And so we want to see something under 4.0, but the lower, the better for sure. And these radon mitigation systems, if you install one in your home, they usually can get the radon levels down below 2. Lots of them around 1 and even less. So we're looking for that number under 4.0. And the only way to know that number is to test. And so in a real estate transaction, and in the laws in Indiana, a homeowner can test their own home, but if it's not your home, you can't test it without a license. And that's why we have radon professionals come in and test homes during a real estate transaction. And so we have all different kinds of testing methods we can choose, but the most popular is to use a continuous radon monitor, which is an electronic device that will give us an hourly reading. Okay, it gives you graphs so we can see how radon levels fluctuate. And it can tell us if people tampered with a test, if people have opened windows. It can tell us if weather has affected a test. So that's really the most popular choice in radon testing for sure during a real estate transaction. So we want to see everyone test so they know where the house is at when it comes to radon levels, and fix that if it does come out 4.0 or above.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I guess 2 questions I have based on some things you were saying. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on these questions because there's a ton to cover, but have you ever encountered a house, or is there such a thing as a house that maybe for whatever reason, the structure type, you just cannot get the radon levels down low enough?
You mean after mitigation?
Correct.
I mean, it can happen, not very often. It does happen though. I mean, and we study that stuff in like continuing education. And I travel throughout the country in 10 different events. And they do have some classes sometimes that are called, the trouble house. Eventually they do get to fix them though. I mean, there's funny things that they do with them, and it's all about the different footprints of that house, how many suction points they have. There's sometimes it's the pressure, whether it's positive or negative pressure happening. But it seems to me that they do solve all of them. But sometimes it takes a team of radon professionals and not just one guy or one company on that problem house. But not too many around our area. There's very few that actually happens to. The system was designed, I mean, these systems to work, so most of them are kind of, I call it cookie cutter. And so, yeah, most of the time they do work. But that does bring up a topic about you need to test after you put in a system to know that it works. The only way to know your radon level, again, is to test it. So when the guys a mitigation company puts in a system, they don't really know. They're assuming I've designed the system to work. It should work. And that's why the EPA and the states will require, as part of the mitigation licensing and protocol, for that mitigator to provide you with a post-mitigation radon test, at least provided by a third party. And so what that means for us is, in a real estate transaction, they can just throw a little canister on the counter with the mitigation paperwork and walk away and say that they've provided you a test. And so they've done their job. But what we find is most people don't conduct those tests themselves. We don't know if that test if the seller takes it with them when they move, if it gets thrown in a drawer, nobody does it. We don't know what happens to that. So we try to tell them, look for it or ask about it, to the mitigation company. Sometimes mitigation companies do hire radon professionals to come in with an electronic monitor afterward. Sometimes I think your best realtor who represents a buyer would negotiate one of those before closing to make sure the system works. And I say that because 1 out of 10 systems doesn't work. And it isn't the fault of the mitigator. It's not like you did anything wrong. It's that you don't know what you're going to get until you test it. You're assuming you did everything right by the design. But sometimes there's things with a house that will cause it not to pass. And they need to make an adjustment. So adjustments would be put in a larger fan, maybe a second suction point. There could be a footing under there they didn't know about. Maybe the crawl needed more attention if there was a crawl space or something. You do need to mitigate all the footprints and not just, if a basement if a house has a basement and a crawl, they're going to need to mitigate both of those. You can't just mitigate one and expect it to work. So there's a lot involved with that, but we have seen so many stories of people who lived in houses for years, had installed a system when they bought it and had no idea it was never working. And so you have to do that test. It's something you just ought to do. People went through all the time and energy to negotiate this in a sale. And, you want to know that it's working. And so it's sad when we have to give the bad news to a seller who's lived there, let's say, for 5 years and say, sorry, it didn't pass. And it probably was never working from the get-go the right way. And an adjustment could have been made. And often those adjustments are just part of the system and the warranty that the mitigator has to give you. It wasn't like it was going to cost you anything else. And so, yeah, we want to see people actually go through post-mitigation testing to know that those systems work.
And so how long, I know you mentioned that some people, sometimes they find out after they've been living in a house for a number of years that their radon levels are higher than they should be. How long with constant radon exposure above the 4.0 typically? I know that everyone's immune system is going to be different, but how long does it take before someone would start to see negative effects as far as developing cancer or long-term consequences?
Sure. Yeah, the cases that we've seen in studying are as little as 8 years. So there have been, I've known 2 people personally, again, when we travel across the United States, belong to different radon action and advocacy groups. I have met 2 people who lived in a home for just 8 years with high levels that did develop lung cancer. One of them is a friend of mine, and she said that she so wished that her realtor would have mentioned the word radon when she bought the house. And that's sometimes that's it, where you're going through the inspection process. And I know it can get expensive with all these different things we want to test, but if you're going to go through that process and want to know that the house is structurally mechanically good, you should also want to know that the health of the house is good too. And that can mean things like radon. It can mean other topics like water or mold or asbestos and things like that. So yeah, 8 years. And what we like to teach people is that the EPA come up with that 4.0 number on purpose because each point is the same as smoking 2.5 cigarettes a day. And so after about 10 cigarettes a day, over, let's say 8-10 years, you can develop lung cancer. So that's why they came up with that number. Another fun fact is that if you have a basement and then a main floor, radon dissipates by about half every level you go up. So if I have a house that tests at 10 in the basement, the main level is going to be about 5 still. So that's still high, you know. We've seen houses, crazy houses, right? They test at 100. So even all the way up on their second floor, maybe where they have bedrooms and stuff, it still can be very high. And so a lot of people will say, oh, I never go down in the basement or whatever, if there's a basement. That doesn't mean that radon isn't on your main floor or even your second floor. It just depends on what your levels are. And everybody's levels are different. So, yeah.
All right. Well, since we're talking about basements, what about houses? Should houses with slabs be tested for radon? What about crawl spaces? I hear commonly that people around here assume that, well, if it's on a slab, you don't need to test for radon. Is there any merit to that?
You want to test all homes, every home, whether has a basement or it doesn't have a basement, for sure, because radon is everywhere. We said it's in the ground. It comes out of the soil up into right, in the cracks of the slab, if there's a slab, definitely through the crawl space. So those statistics that I said in Indiana is about 30%. That it doesn't matter what kind of house you have, it's 30%. So if we took 10 houses all on slabs, 3 of them would test high. The statistics are the same, but people don't think that. You're right, because we do hear that. Oh, no basement, I don't need to test that. They associate a basement with radon because it's underground, but that has nothing to do with it, because that soil gas comes right out of the ground, up into where we are breathing. So yes, the largest test I've seen in the southern part of Allen County was 90 on a crawl. Yeah, so that happens. My own daughter's house in New Haven is on a slab, 2 different footprints. We had a 12 and an 8. So it does happen for sure. Every week we're testing houses on slabs and crawls that still test high.
So does radon care if the house is brand new construction? I hardly ever have a request to test for radon on a new house.
Funny that you say that. So the tighter the house, statistically, you could have a higher test. So the draftier the house, we do see lower tests. So new houses can be worse because they're so efficient and tight over an older drafty house. Now that doesn't mean anything really. I mean, in the big scheme of things, it's old house, new house, basement, no basement. We should be testing all homes because you just don't know what's in the soil under that house. And the funny part about radon is a lot of people will say, oh, my neighbor tested fine, so I don't need to test. It isn't necessarily, we do see hot spots, but it's not necessarily your neighborhood per se, because the soil gas can travel as much as 2-3 miles underneath the ground like this and just pop up at your foundation where you have a high test, but your neighbor does not. And so that's why we have to test all homes, and you can never assume. But again, we do see some hot spots. I have seen that. New Haven seems to be a hot spot there. The Covington area has a hot spot. We kind of know that sometimes when we get too many in a row that are high. And sometimes you can drive through a neighborhood and just kind of look on the sides of houses to see, there's more mitigation pipes in this neighborhood than not. So, yeah, but again, I'd rather have a house that had a system for sure than no system. Yeah.
What are some other myths that you commonly hear with radon? or just points of education?
Yeah. I think that people kind of think that they only have to test once. And so I'll often hear a phone call where someone said, oh, we moved in, 8 years ago and we tested, it was fine. So we don't need to test it. We were good. No. So it's a soil gas. It changes underground all the time. It can come and go. And so that's why we do see radon levels fluctuate. And the Surgeon General and the EPA tell everybody to test every 2 years. That's what they've come up with scientifically, that's a good recommendation. And so we have seen people who have tested in a real estate transaction maybe 2 years ago that had a good test and went and sold that quickly. 2 years later, they came out with a higher test. And then they were mad about that, saying, wait, we tested, but things do change. Things change all the time underneath the ground. And there's other factors too, like the different seasons. I know that, in the winter when we have the house shut up, you can have higher levels. It doesn't mean you will have higher levels, but you can have higher levels. And it's all about the pressures and the stack effect. So I'm running the furnace and I am sucking more, up this way through the foundation because of that stack effect. So I might see higher levels then. It doesn't necessarily mean it will happen. But and then the other thing is that the best test truly, is a year-long test, right? A long-term year-long test that you would not use an electronic device for. There's other devices for that. Because then that shows kind of how you use the house over the year with all the different seasons and all the different weather to kind of see what you get. We can't do that in a real estate transaction. Obviously, we have a very short window, and that's why the EPA came up with these electronic devices where we can take a really short, quick picture in time. And I want people to understand that that's never a guarantee. It's just a picture in time of that one moment, whatever weather that was, those 2 days and the way people come and go in the house. We try to give those guidelines of, hey, we're having a radon test. We really try to keep the house shut up as much as possible. We call it normal living conditions, but closed house conditions, which means I'm not going to purposefully open the windows and enjoy the breeze. So I'm not going to purposely have my slider door open because it's 65 out today and I want some fresh air. No, we're going to want to keep that shut up. But can I come and go? Yes. Can I go in the basement and do my laundry? You bet. That's a normal living condition. So those things are going to happen all the time. Can I let my dog out? You bet you. You're going to open it up, let your dog out, let your dog back in. I'm just not going to enjoy the breeze. So that's what in the real estate transaction, we try to do normal living conditions, but closed house conditions. Now, what might not be normal is vacant houses who've been shut up for a really long time. Nobody's coming and going. So there's some stagnant air there. It's not like we invalidate those tests or anything, but that is probably a less accurate picture, okay, than a house that's occupied and being used. So we kind of just look at that and we do the best we can, right? All of us inspectors during this real estate transaction to give you the best picture we can with what we have to work with. And so I think sometimes you need to factor that in too and say, well, this is what it is, but nobody's living here. No one's coming and going. There haven't even been showings or anything. You know what I mean? That can happen sometimes. So we just do the best we can to give you the information at the time.
And as I was doing some Googling, just trying to prepare a little bit for this, I noticed people kept talking about radon levels in water. I've never heard of that before. Is that something the city tests for? Is that something people need to be concerned with? Because, educate me on this. I know nothing about it.
Sure. So if you were researching that, right, the EPA would tell you if the home was on a well that and you had high radon levels in your air when you tested it, that water could be a source of the radon. It can be for sure, not in Indiana, not in our area. So like the best scientists that we know that study this stuff all over the world do come together for these national radon symposiums. And they've taught us in our education that there are certain places in the United States that's prevalent, but it's definitely not here in our area. So our laboratory has conducted those tests for people who really insist on doing them, even though we try to talk them out of that one because we know it will be a good test every time because of our geographic area. And it is always a good test. We've never seen a positive. But what I can tell you about it is this. It can be a source elsewhere. The numbers on it are amazing. So you know how we said 4.0 is for 4 picocuries, and the air is what we want to see. Well, that's what the action limit is at. In water, it's 10,000. Okay, so you'd have to have 10,000 for it to be, anything that you'd even be concerned of. Okay, and so like the tests that we've seen are all like 75, 325. It's not even close to that number every time we do conduct one of those tests. So we try to tell people it's not a concern where we live, but I understand where they've read that because it can be elsewhere. So we don't test the water around here. We just mitigate the air. Yeah, it's definitely something that I don't think we have a problem with around here. Mm-hmm.
Okay, two follow-up questions, just out of curiosity at this point, since it really doesn't affect us in Indiana. So is it like lead that there's a concern if you drink it that it's going to hurt your body, or does it just contaminate the air? And then how do they mitigate the radon out of the water?
Oh, water. Yeah. So just like if you were breathing it, the radon decay particles, actually you're breathing it, that particle attaches to the tissue in your lung and it starts messing with your cells. And so it changes things up, and that is what starts those free radicals and cancer causing things. And so the same with radon and water, you're ingesting it and those particles are messing, with your insides. And so, it can be dangerous. As for mitigating radon in water, aeration is one of the methods. Charcoal filters is another method. And the city utilities have to test for that too. If you ever looked at one of your municipalities' water test results, radon and radium and uranium would all be on there. And it's, like I said, in our area, it's always 0 or whatever. So they don't really have to do anything to mitigate that. So you can feel good about your city utilities for sure when it comes to anything radioactive. And again, in Indiana, I don't think it's an issue here. We do have a big air problem though. Yeah.
All right. So I have I guess one other follow-up question I'll ask later. Do you have any other maybe more pressing issues or things that you want to talk about as far as radon, other myths?
Weather. The weather. I want to talk about the weather because a lot of times you'll get someone who will say, hey, it's raining outside. I don't want you to do this test. Well, guess what? It rains in Fort Wayne and it rains everywhere, right? In Indiana. But the protocol does have some things built in about weather, and it's severe weather. And it's severe weather defined by, the National Weather Service. So you're talking about really heavy winds or crazy amounts of rain in a very short period of time. And what's great, though, about the instruments that we use in professional testing is that we can see that on the graphs. We can see that the weather came through because those instruments also log the weather, okay? And then we can see that the radon levels changed because of the weather. A great example I can give you is this. We had a radon test done where we set it on a Friday, picked it up on Monday in a neighborhood that was villas. So they all looked the same. And the footprints of these houses were exactly the same. And they were right across the street from each other, literally. It was kind of cool that we had, a villa on one side of the street, the same villa on the other side of the street. And a storm came through that weekend. And on one of the tests, completely fine test, 2.5, I think. Okay. No weird weather showing up on there that affected their radon levels. The weather was on there, but the radon levels were consistent. At the other villa across the street, you did see a storm spike in the graph, and the weather did affect things at that house, and it tested at 9, okay, because of a big spike. And so we like to say, we're not going to avoid the weather when we test. We're going to let the test sit there and see what we get, because weather can affect your test, but it might not. want to see what we get first before we go further in discussing, should we test some more, or conduct another test without adverse weather. So we do see that sometimes it affects it. The other thing about weather is it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not accurate. So if your house is one of those houses where every time it's, got a storm rolls in, and you're going to have higher levels at that time, because that's just how things are in that house, you should have mitigation systems so that levels are good all the time. I mean, I have heard people say that they're definitely putting a system in because they don't want to have to avoid the basement or whatever during adverse weather. Now, we all know this is a long-term, health effect, but yeah, I try to encourage people that even with bad weather, let's just see what we get first to see if there's a concern, and then we can talk about it after that. So, yeah.
Are there any ways that people, homeowners, the sellers in particular, try to cheat on the test? I know you mentioned something about that you can tell if they've opened up their doors and windows to maybe lower the levels. Talk about that. How do you know if someone does that, or what are some ways people try to cheat, and what precautions or safeguards do you have in place to be able to catch that?
Sure. Yeah, that's always fun, right? So there's many things. First of all, every one of the electronic devices these days has sensors on it. So if anyone's ever moved the machine, so we lock down our machines so you can't move them. So we would know if you moved it. We would know if windows were open or if a fan was on. That's what we see the most, is people will turn on fans, or they will open the windows. And that's because I said that the machines actually gauge the temperature in the home, the humidity level in the home, has the pressures outside the barometric pressure. So we can see those differences. We can see when, especially like recently in the winter, if someone's furnace is on and you can see that the house temperature in the basement is, let's say, 68 degrees, and then all of a sudden the furnace goes out and we've come back to pick up the test and it's like 40 something in there, you can totally see that drop, on the graph, in the information that we have there. And so we can tell when people open windows. I just had a home inspector this week that said when he arrived, the windows were open in the basement. And we could see exactly on that graph when the people opened those windows, because everything changes on those graphs. So I don't think that homeowners realize that the devices today are, the technology is so good that we can monitor those things, but we do. And so we have to have that conversation then with the realtor and say, hey, we see this, on the graph, and letting you know that this probably isn't a very accurate test. And you're probably going to have to go back to the sellers and say, something happened here that changed these levels. It kind of looks like maybe, windows might have been open. So we'd like to conduct another test, and you're going to have to pay for that because we did leave you the instructions that we needed this all shut up. So it doesn't happen as often as it used to before those devices had those sorts of tampering measures built in. That it's kind of newer, the past maybe 10 years. So before that, it was a lot harder to prove things, but now we can totally see that. So yeah, it's definitely helpful in getting a more accurate test. Fans, I've literally walked into a Radon pickup one day when a lady had a box fan directly blowing on the unit, And so, I mean, they obviously didn't remember when we were coming back to pick that up. And so, that's just going to blow everything out to the walls, and we're not going to get a good reading there. So we did have to do a new test there for sure. So it's hard sometimes to get people to cooperate when they have it in their head that I'm going to pass this test, I'm going to do anything I can to cheat on this test. It's sad, it causes cancer. This hurts people. I think that people are scared, but maybe they don't know how inexpensive it is to truly fix it. So when I say inexpensive, I'm talking about in the big picture of a real estate transaction. You're talking about a home that's the biggest purchase of your life, or selling a home is the biggest transaction you'll have. Most mitigation systems are around that $1,000 mark. So it's not as bad as a new roof or a new furnace and things like that. You're talking about $1,000. to prevent lung cancer. And so I think anyone would agree with me, and they would trade that $1,000 over having to pay for chemotherapy or losing a loved one over it. And so I think if people really thought about it that way, there would be less, tampering. So, yeah.
And could you just spend a couple minutes? I know you talked briefly about it before, kind of explain the system the EPA has put in as far as those points. And you mentioned that it's somehow tied to the equivalent of smoking X number of cigarettes per day.
Yeah. In our radon education, they really want people to understand what those numbers mean. And so scientists were able to put that together for us to say, hey, this is the same, each point of radon, because your tests are going to show 1.0 or 4.0 or 8.0, that kind of thing. Each point is like the same as breathing 2.5 cigarettes a day. So you're breathing that many carcinogens, and over time, that 8 to 10 year mark is the smallest amount of time that we've seen that can cause lung cancer. And so you'll find people who have been never smokers, who've lived in a house, that have gotten lung cancer from the high radon that they've had. There was even a story that I remember from a few years ago where a lady sold her house. The buyer had come in and did a test, and the test was high, so they mitigated. And the seller had moved, and about 4 months after she moved, she was diagnosed with lung cancer. Never smoker, because of the house she just moved from had high levels, and she had lived there a really long time. And that's what the doctors then associated that, her cancer was from. Now, you have to take into consideration as well that you might not know what you've been breathing since you were a baby. Okay, so this is something that it isn't just this house that you lived in, or living in now, it's the house that all the homes that you've been in. I have been able to meet a few people who were diagnosed with radon-induced lung cancer that were able to go back to every home that they've lived in to test, because they were so curious and they had the ability to do that, and people cooperated with them in their search for an answer. They wanted to know why or which house, kind of thing. And so there have been some people that have been able to do that to pinpoint where that came from. And then, of course, at the same time, I know we're talking about houses, but it could also be where you work. It could be a teacher at a school. We're starting to test schools now in Indiana, and people are spending 8 hours or more a day in a school building. And there are definitely places like schools that have it, or workplaces. We have tested senior living centers that have radon everywhere. Universities, we've done apartment complexes, colleges. There's a place that we just recently tested this past fall, dormitory situation at a university, and as high as the second level had high levels of radon in the 4s and 5s. Down in Florida, you'll see the 3rd, 4th, 5th level of condominium buildings having high radon because it goes right through the concrete. It knows no boundaries, kind of like lead. It's one of those things that it's bad for you. And we want to see it fixed, but you got to find out what your level is first. So we want people to test it. And when they find the high levels, we want them to fix it. So.
And I guess the last question I would have for you, maybe you have more to add, but why do some people think and believe that radon, they think it's almost like voodoo, that it really doesn't exist, that it's just this magical made up thing? I even know a friend of mine who, when they were buying their house, tested high for radon. So they went through the process, they got the radon mitigation system, and afterwards they're like, we think this is a scam. So is there something maybe at the beginning of radon testing, like when it was in its infancy stages, 10, 15, 20 years ago, is there some reason that's caused people to think that this is just truly made up?
Well, it's funny how it was actually discovered. I think it's almost 30 years now, really. But back in the 80s, there was a gentleman who was working on a project at a nuclear facility, and when they leave work, he would have to go through a detector to make sure that all the radioactivity was off of their bodies. And this guy was beeping on the way into work, not on the way out. And so they're, a bunch of science people anyway. So they were so curious about, why are you beeping on the way into work? And so they were able to take some of the devices that they had at work. And back then they weren't little like we have today, a little testing device. They were huge contraptions that they had to set up at this guy's house. His name was Stanley. And they found that his house had high radon gas. And it was the first time that had ever been even thought of. And so it started this whole thing. The EPA had no idea what to do with that. No one ever thought that was a thing, and they weren't even sure how to be able to test houses. And it was actually a pretty cool thing. I happen to know, I call him the grandfather of radon. I happen to know one of the gentlemen that was in on that project then with the EPA. And he owns a radon company today. He's in his elder years. He's taught me that this topic has just evolved as they've learned about it. So it wasn't very popular to test for because they didn't know what they were looking at. They didn't have the right devices, but over time they were able to invent those things, create those things. And so then it was really in the real estate transaction that it started to really be the spot that they could get people's attention to be able to test. And so there are some states that have laws that you have to test. Indiana's not one of them, but I'll tell you that the stats that I see is 20 years ago, we had maybe 20-30% of people testing radon during their real estate transaction. Now you're up to about 80-ish% of people testing. So awareness has been increasing. The American Lung Association and other radon groups have come together to try to really advocate and spread that. And now, again, we're starting to even test in schools, businesses. HUD now has a rule that if you're buying a multifamily property, you have to test that property. If you refinance, also, you have to test. And so we do see a lot of those commercial transactions too, with multifamily properties. So I'm talking about apartment complexes, senior living centers, places like that, that are testing now. So it's something that wasn't popular back then, but it is much more so now. As for it being a scam or that sort of thing, I like to tell sellers, because that is a thing. Sometimes we'll walk in a house and they'll start, saying, yeah, I don't believe in this and this is dumb. And I'll say, I understand that because we can't see this gas or smell it, you're not going to think about it. And you can certainly feel like it's I don't see it, I don't see it, I don't smell it. It's not really a thing. But it is on the periodic table. It's element number 86. I didn't make that up. That periodic table has been around for a really long time. It actually comes from uranium rock underneath the ground. And we all know that they build bombs out of that. Okay, it's bad for you. And so this uranium rock over time decays under the ground all the way to a gaseous state, which we call radon. So we're breathing that, but it actually keeps decaying. And if it kept decaying, it ends up as lead. And we all know that lead is really bad for us. So if you understand the science of it, you would understand that it is real, even though we can't see it and smell it. So yeah, it does exist. And, we want to just be able to breathe the best air we can. And for us, most of us, that's going to be outside, but inside we want to test to make sure that we don't have dangerous levels. And if we do, we can fix it. So.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I probably should have asked you at the beginning, but can you just tell people who don't know who you are, what's your background? And I mean, you actually own a laboratory, which when I found out I was blown away by that. So if you can maybe talk a little bit about who you are, your background, kind of, and what you guys do all the time.
Sure. My career started back in the home inspection business. My husband was a home inspector, and he was a brand new home inspector. And we were selling our house. And the home inspector for the buyer came in and set a radon machine in our basement, and we didn't know what that was. So this was, quite a while ago. And our basement tested at 16, and I didn't even know what that meant, but they told us it was high and it was bad and we needed to fix it. So because we were in the home inspection business, I said, I got to find out what this is. I don't know what this is. And so I studied it, and I realized that this is a huge deal, especially my own basement being at 16. So imagine how many cigarettes that is, because my treadmill was down there, my baby's playroom was down there, my home office was down there in the basement. I lived in the basement. So I was really upset about that. Now, luckily, we hadn't lived in that home for very long, so it was kind of a short-term thing. But it bothered me enough, that we were exposed to that unknowingly and didn't know anything about radon, that I made it my mission to find out what it was and offer that testing in our business. And at the time, we were a growing business, and I ended up being one of our licensed testers. So I went through that education and became a licensed tester all the way back then. And I loved it. I loved the science of it. It was very interesting to me. I loved working with the clients and being able to educate them and realtors about it. And there were so many myths about it, so much misinformation about it, that I kind of made it my mission to educate. So that just kind of evolved over the years, and we ended up just increasing the amount of people who were testing in transactions. That it's a good thing. We're able to keep the data, where we were able to create maps to show realtors and homeowners, where these hot spots were in our area and why they want to test. And so, over time, that just grew and grew and grew, where we used to get excited about testing a few houses. And today, my company today tests over 2,000 houses a year. And so that's a lot of great testing, and so we're saving lives. And I like to teach people that in the real estate industry. If you're a realtor and you're recommending these tests, you are seriously saving people's lives. You're changing something where they could have ended up with this lung cancer. And if you would talk to any of the people who've actually had it, which I see at all these conferences that I go to, they would trade it for the radon test that they didn't have. They wish they did, they didn't know. And so realtors do really save lives. But yeah, I've been testing for more than 20 years now. And I left the home inspection industry and decided to really take environmental testing, because that's kind of what I loved. And let all you great home inspectors do your thing with the structure and the mechanics of the home, but we can work together as a team. And so our team does the health of the home. And so, we're looking at things like radon for sure, and water and asbestos and mold, things that can cause health issues. And we want to make sure that your new home is healthy, so it doesn't make you sick. And again, save lives and prevent terrible things like cancer. So.
Okay, thank you. Anything else you think we need to end with, or?
I think we've covered a lot.
Yeah.
Covered a lot. I think when it comes to radon, you're going to see in the future more advocacy for testing things like schools or businesses. Maybe even get it required someday for FHA loans or that sort of thing in the real estate industry. And those are not bad things. I know some people try to fight that and say it's, these regulatory things aren't good, but they are, because they save lives. We care. This is what we do all day, and we don't do it just to make money. We do it because we care about people and we want to change their lives, because we've seen so many sick people come through our business, whether it was a water test, that their water was contaminated at home and they were sick. Those are real things, and we can prevent those things. And these are things that don't cost a lot, So we do work hard in our business to participate in legislative things down in Indianapolis, and we do the radon continuing education that we need to do and teach our people. So, we're out there just testing every day, and we want to keep people healthy.